Farsi is the founder and president of the NIAC, that's the National Iranian American Council, based here in D.C. He says that the lower oil prices are seen as having an important impact on those upcoming nuclear talks.
There's a sense in the West that the lower oil prices actually added pressure to the Iranians, so that the Iranians are in greater need of being able to get a deal because they're selling a very small amount of oil compared to what they could at very low prices. At the same time, if Iranian oil comes onto the market, that can actually suppress prices even further, weakening the oil prices, which will be to the benefit of the Western world and generally the oil consumers rather than the oil producers. But I think in the long run, it is actually not the price of oil that will be critical to the Iranians, because the Iranians need sanctions relief in order to be able to develop their economy in other areas but oil. To a certain extent, Iran has already lost the critical place in the oil market that it had pre-sanctions. It's not going to be able to regain it after the sanctions either.
How relevant is OPEC today than it was a decade ago?
OPEC is obviously still a very relevant organization, but we've seen that its relevance tends to go up and down, which oftentimes is a direct relationship to how united OPEC is internally. If they can act as a unitary actor, then they can have a significant impact on oil prices. Right now, there are significant differences within OPEC. The Saudis have replaced a lot of Iranian oil. They're keeping oil prices low. The Iranians would like to see a higher oil price. So when there are divisions within OPEC, then OPEC essentially becomes a paralyzed actor and a less relevant actor.
There's a fairly large country to the north that's also a very large oil exporter. How does Russia factor into OPEC, oil prices, and the current environment that we see today?
I would say that Russia probably is a bigger factor when it comes to gas. The Iranians are also one of the largest reserves of natural gas. They're not a very big exporter yet because of sanctions that has disabled them from developing their gas industry and their gas sector, but have a great potential to become a key player in the gas section. And that's a potentially rival role to that of the Russians. And right now, with Europe cutting and reducing or desiring to reduce their dependency on Russian gas, mindful of the political conflict that they have with Russia right now, the attractiveness of the idea of being able to rely a bit more on Iranian gas is entering into the conversations in Europe. But there's also another factor that actually has nothing to do with gas or with oil. There are countries, not small ones either, that view Iran as a natural buffer against the type of Sunni radicalism and Salafism that has its roots in Saudi Arabia and that is reaching Central Asia, that has the ability, if it hasn't already reached large parts of Europe. Iran, as a Shia Islamic nation, is seen as a natural buffer, and as a result needs to be utilized rather than isolated when it comes to this conflict in regards to the spread of radical Islam.
Is that also the view of the general public in Iran when they think of sort of the West, the United States, and sort of what's happened over the past 6 months?
I'm not so sure that that argument has entered into the consciousness of the population over there. Clearly they would like to break out of their isolation. Clearly they believe that they are more compatible with the West and some of the countries in the region that are very close allies of the United States. But at the same time, I think there's a strong desire for a friendship with the United States, but there's also a very strong desire for having an independent foreign policy and not necessarily becoming an ally, or in the way that they would perhaps describe it, a proxy of the United States. So I don't see the nuclear deal leading to a U.S.-Iranian alliance similar to what happened during the time of the Shah. But there can still be tactical and even strategic collaboration, even though they're not allies.
You mentioned earlier you were optimistic that a deal could be done. What if it's not? What happens next?
It all depends on how it breaks down. If it's a complete breakdown of diplomacy, then the name of the game on both sides, according to Wendy Sherman, the American lead negotiator, is escalation. And I think she's right.
What do you mean by escalation?
Escalation means that the Iranians would go back and they would expand their nuclear program, add more centrifuges, perhaps go up to 20% enrichment as well. And on the American side, there would at a minimum be an emphasis on new sanctions, and at a maximum perhaps even measures to take military action. We would be back to where we were before diplomacy got serious.
Is there no middle ground?
There is a middle ground, that they may continue to negotiate, they may have a partial deal, good enough to keep diplomacy going, but not good enough to have a final seal on the deal. That is also a scenario. The question is, would the political environment in Iran and in Washington permit a partial deal to survive? Because those who are opposed to a deal, those who are opposed to the negotiations, are getting emboldened by every day that the negotiations drag on beyond its deadline.